there's always something. I usually coach sellers that get ready for a root canal that's going to take 60 to 120 days, and you're going to have every nook and cranny explored through this process. It's important for you as a buyer to understand the amount of stress that these sellers go through. They get extremely anxious. A lot of times there is, I'll call it a critical nature, or there's bad news, there's stuff that is offensive to them. They get very defensive, and you want to make sure you've got really good bedside manner if you identify some things that may or may not have been a surprise, but you just use kid gloves as you're communicating with the seller. And like I say, there's always something. It could be in the Q of E that the accountants do, or the working capital analysis, environmental issues. If they find something on a phase 1, they're going to get a phase 2. This stuff scares sellers to death. Equipment and CapEx, things that aren't necessarily financial related in due diligence, but what is the condition of the equipment? What is the appraised value of the equipment? Is your CapEx up to date? We touch a little bit on benefits plans and tax and HR. Is there outstanding litigation that's identified? Customer due diligence. This is typically one of the areas that's done at the very end of the process, but you should expect if somebody's paying a premium price for your business and you've got some customer concentration or key customer relationships, they'll want to validate that those customers are going to be around afterwards. Likewise, if you've got really unique intellectual property or technology, that it is as good and as bulletproof as what you say that it is. So, stuff comes up. We always say it. Our role as an intermediary begins to be kind of handholder to both sides and help to take what is perceived as bad news and just validate, is it really, really bad news? Is this something that has serious implications or ramifications, or is it just identifying potential stuff and to help quantify and qualify that? We begin the process, regardless of what side we're representing, to make sure that we're going into it, that we want to have a sense of being fair. Sellers want to know that they're going to be treated fairly through this process, and we're not throwing everything, you as the buyer, everything in the kitchen sink in there to retread a deal at the end. I think that starts off a transaction with bad faith, and it's probably not a good best practice. So when do you revisit the terms of the transaction? Typically what we say, if I'm dealing with a client that's less than $20 million in revenue, they typically don't have a whole lot of resources to help support them in going through a sales process. And I can almost guarantee that their business will be negatively impacted through the process of the sale and the process of due diligence. You may have guys that have been, chief leaders in managing the sales or managing the operations, and they're completely distracted for 6 months as they go through this process. And so if there's some hiccup and the business is off 15% over the kind of previous 3 months before closing, we do identify what is the reason for that. Did they lose a big customer? Did they lose a key salesperson or employee? Did they lose a key supplier? If they didn't, we'll typically plead with the buyer, don't retread the deal. This is a huge distraction. Everything else is in place. On the other hand, if in due diligence you find out that you are about to lose a customer, they lost a key customer, I think to be fair to both sides, you should expect that there may be a retrade that's due at that period. In the end, if you're the buyer, you want to validate the predictability and the reliability of the business that you're buying, and you're getting what you bargained for. Okay? And if you can validate that, all businesses have little speed bumps along the way and hiccups, but if you can validate that for all intents and purposes, what you think you're going to get, that's going to be great. I would say go ahead and do it. I wanted to bring up one area that is often another point of contention for sellers is variances to GAAP. A lot of times they may be filing their tax returns on a cash basis, or they don't necessarily use pure GAAP financial structure. And so some of the big items that we see that often have an impact on the quality of earnings are reserves for doubtful accounts, receivable, inventory write-downs. It's really, really common that guys don't write down inventory like they should if it's not being consumed in an ordinary basis, and then they're not accruing for other normal GAAP type accrual items. So I would just say, again, these are some of the areas where you want to have kit gloves. Don't make them bigger than what they are, but just manage that carefully.